Welcome to this installment of Witness to Yesterday, the podcast of the Champlain Society. My name is Nicole O'Byrne. Today I will be speaking with Monika Gagnon and Brandon Webb about their co-edited book, Concordia University at 50, A Collective History, published by Concordia University Press in 2024. Monika Gagnon is a distinguished professor emerita of communication studies at Concordia University and a recipient of the 2025 Lifetime Achievement Award from the University Art Association of Canada. Her co-editor, Brandon Webb, holds a doctorate from the Department of History at Concordia University, where he currently teaches as a sessional instructor. He has published articles on media history and Cold War culture, a Cluj Fellow at the Library of Congress in 2024. His current research focuses on cultural labor and the political economy of print media. Monika and Brandon, thank you so much for joining me today on Witness to Yesterday.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Nicole. It's great to be here.
Concordia University at 50 offers a collective history featuring essays, interviews, and oral histories. How does this multi-perspective format deepen our understanding of Concordia's complex past compared with a traditional single-author history?
So this book was originally conceived by the former head librarian at Concordia, Guylaine Baudry, who's now at McGill University. And she worked with the former provost, Anne Whitelaw, to kind of develop the idea for the book for the 50th anniversary of Concordia. And so originally it was set up through a series of consultations and then also an open call for proposals from the entire Concordia community. And then there was also an advisory committee that was set up, which consisted of Stephen High, Catherine Wild, and myself originally. But then later, when I became one of the lead editors, I was replaced by Jason Camlott. And then that committee looked through the proposals and started piecing together what would basically be the table of contents for the book. And Guylaine had also reached out initially to some writers across the university to ensure that certain aspects of Concordia's history was going to be represented. So in this sense, we could say that the book was kind of crowdsourced from the university community in a very broad sense. And I think that's one distinctive thing. It was an open call for proposals from, alumni, from staff, and from faculty and students. And then for us, once the chapters began rolling in, they really had very different rhetorical styles and voices because of the kind of broad diversity of writers that were basically contributing. And so we decided as editors to start leaning into those distinctions and differences rather than trying to homogenize a particular style. So that meant in certain instances that we were making much shorter pieces as opposed to longer, extensive pieces. Some are about 7,500 words. And then, as you've observed also, we had oral histories and we also had archival documents and photographs that we were adding to that as well. So as editors, we also found ourselves, once we had the initial material in, trying to kind of reach out to get some coverage and representation of different topics that were much less familiar to us. And Brandon can give his take on it. He was with the project longer than I was, actually.
Yeah, so I was actually hired by Guylaine in September 2021, and I was just finishing my dissertation. I was doing the formatting and going through that headache. But it was nice to come out of that exercise of writing a dissertation and joining a project like this. And one of the first things that Guylaine had me do, which I think was a great idea, was I read the consultation meeting minutes to get a sense of what people were asking for in terms of different ways to mark the anniversary. And a lot of people, this was, consultations with longtime staff and faculty, really said that, don't do a single author top-down institutional history. Try to do something different, whatever that is. And Guylaine also suggested that I read institutional history, so kind of like this subgenre of historiography that I personally didn't know much about, besides seeing these books, in the bookstore, different universities and so forth. So that was kind of a neat exercise because I was able to get a sense of how this kind of field, how different authors in the field approach their topics. And it was clear from this exercise, and again, people familiar with these histories will know this, that traditional model of an institutional history is usually top down, written by a single author, usually a retired professor, that covers key events that people are going to be familiar with, but really does an archival deep dive through meeting minutes of board of directors, whether it's the rector's office, provost's office, or president, I should say. And from a periodization standpoint, even we'll use sometimes different administrative leaders to mark the different eras of a university, and would also typically have, in other institutional histories, a kind of through line, a narrative through line that sometimes it would be the university's motto that the general public would be familiar with, or people that are familiar working in that and studying that institution. So, and certainly our book has those elements, but we clearly took a different approach. And I think in doing that, one of the things that we wanted to ask, which maybe these other histories didn't quite get at, or was implicit at least, was, what is a university? It's not just a collection of buildings. It's not just a bureaucratic administering of higher education. It's clearly those things, but it's also much more. So I think our book tries to answer that question of what is a university by looking at overlapping but distinct communities, and how within those communities, people have different experiences of what the university is. And I think now, at a time when higher ed is in crisis, not just in Quebec, where Anglophone English institutions clearly are, not just in Canada, but in the wider field of higher ed, those are important questions. So I hope readers kind of walk away thinking about those questions and thinking in the end, any university, not just Concordia, is really about the people and the relationships that people make along the way. Not to get too corny about it, but that's what defines a university experience for students. It defines it for longtime faculty like Monika, for instance, decades of experience. And the staff as well. Our book featured voices from staff, the people that, make the university run on a day-to-day basis. So I think all that kind of adds up to that multiplicity of perspectives that we were hoping for.
Well, I think the format's a very effective way of reflecting such a multifaceted institution as a university, because as you say, it's not really about the buildings, it's the relationships and the people and the events that occur there. And you really encapsulate that with this approach. What were some of the challenges involved in putting together such a kaleidoscopic view of an institution?
Well, I probably speak for both Brandon and I to say that the more that we started learning about the university through the texts themselves as they started coming in, but as we started doing research, the more we felt we didn't know. Neither of us, we came from humanities departments. We didn't know very much about sports and athletics, for example. We hadn't received anything in the call for proposals or from any texts at that stage of any sports. And so we really, at that point, had to start kind of extending what we knew about the university into areas that we didn't know about at that time and meeting people. I'd say it really was a highlight for both of us. We said this as we were doing the project itself, how many amazing people we met at the university. I mean, we're 57,000 people at the university at this time right now, which, is a combination of faculty, of committed staff, of students. So we're like a small, well, actually probably a large village. I'm not sure exactly what the numbers are for the populations for these different categories, but it really was a highlight to meet so many people. So the logical thing for us was to reach out to Concordia's records and archives, who already were involved in the project, but a little bit more distant. And we developed such close relationships with specifically Eric Cote and Olivier Bissaillon-Lemay, who then really were kind of shadow editors with us, who started digging up material for us, who started digitizing it and making it available in high res so that we'd be able to publish it in the book. And so we really began developing this amazing relationship with them that I think really transformed what the book itself became. The other thing, too, is that I did bring on board a designer. It was Rodolfo Borello and his partner, Jennifer DeFreitas of Associé Libre, I've worked on many books over several decades, who I know are very visual. And so they came on early on as well to also work almost like as collaborators with us with their expertise and their kind of design wisdom to help shape the book and bring in a lot of different ideas.
I spent a lot of my time in archives, so I know how wonderful it can be. What were some of the highlights of working so closely with Concordia's records management and archives, and how did this impact the book?
So to add to what Monika was saying, public history, raises broader issues about, how is history transmitted? What is remembered? What is represented? And so on. And the kind of conventional, maybe academic narrative doesn't necessarily represent that. So knowing that we kind of approached the archives, or tried to anyways, in a creative way. And as Monika said, Eric and Olivier, I worked with, every day almost. So like we were in constant communication. Olivier found lots of images, digitized them for us. They were incredible. Eric had a wealth of knowledge to bring to find information on a lot of the sources that were incomplete. So part of it too of public history is getting people excited about the history that they're a part of. So we tried to approach it thinking, people will bring their own materials to the archives. They might, in terms of deposits or things that they were part of in different eras of the university and so on. It was so, and I think the archival materials that we presented in the book helped fill in some content gaps. And Monika had mentioned the design element. There was some great photos that we used of full spread news articles from Concordia publications, student publications like The Link, but also the institutional publication that ran for many years, Concordia's Thursday Report, which would be weekly. And all this was preserved at the archives, the records management archives. And so you see in the book at different points, the print might be a bit small at points, but information in those articles that actually covers the kinds of things that are typically covered in institutional histories.
Well, now I understand why it's such a beautiful book. There you had a visual designer and people who put a lot of thought and effort into that. Concordia University Press should be congratulated for producing such a visually stunning book. Every page I turned, there was a new wonder that awaited in the next page in the next section. I've never seen anything like it. But let's get back down to the history here. In his contribution, historian Ronald Rudin examines the influence of the Quiet Revolution and the founding of Concordia. What key factors shaped the founding of Concordia?
It's an excellent question, Nicole, and I'm going to follow as close as possible what Ron Rudin contributed to in his chapter, which I think was masterful because every writer asked us at different points for more words, and we said no every time. But Ron had also did an expanded version of this piece for listeners that are interested for a journal article. And I think, he says it right at the beginning. It's actually what really leads to the creation of Concordia is a decision not taken at Loyola or Sir George Williams University. It was events happening at UDM, University de Montreal. And once UDM had decided, because they had a new rector that kind of looked upon this long-standing arrangement of Jesuit institutions having their degrees granted through UDM, but UDM not really having any kind of control over the curriculum or so forth, that it was an antiquated idea. So UDM basically revised its charter, I think it was in 1967, to change that. And that the way Ron describes that means the clock is ticking then on Loyola. And the backstory that Ron also tells in that chapter is that there had been attempts throughout the 20th century from Loyola administratives, different administrations, to get a university charter. And for various different reasons, were unsuccessful doing that. But by the 1960s, with the Quiet Revolution, with this turn to secularization, a greater emphasis on language politics, and awakening Quebecois nationalism and so forth, that the idea of having three Anglophone institutions, English institutions, was not politically acceptable in that climate for the Quebec government. So that kind of larger backdrop put the writing on the wall, so to speak. And I think what Ron does, again, in his chapter, it shows, the other part of the story, of course, is Sir George Williams. And for Sir George, they had been a degree granting institution for a while, roots in the YMCA, going back to 1926, 1948, roughly around there. It becomes a university, but it doesn't officially change its name until I think 1959. All to say is in the 60s, at the same time, Sir George is trying to create its own identity, and it's also trying to figure out how do we be a comprehensive university. So they have their own issues, and there was a lot of oral histories that attested to that from that kind of merger generation. The architects of the merger, I should say. We have a few excerpts in the book, interviews taken in 1980, where a lot of these people were reflecting from the Sir George side and saying, look, I mean, we were trying to figure out how to be a university ourselves. So we weren't looking necessarily for a merger. And Loyola, of course, wanted to have its own distinct identity preserved and was worried about being swallowed up in a larger institution. Sir George had the problem of space downtown, had no green space. It didn't have the same campus identity and culture that Loyola had in abundance. So, it seemed like a good match in a lot of different ways, but they both had their own problems. And I think what Ron does is narrates this story with these larger historical forces shaping decision-making. Once we get into 1971, 1972, it's really inevitable that this is going to happen. But in terms of the form it's going to take, it's still not clear. And so I think once the council report comes out in 1972, I believe it was, they need to figure it out, and they need to figure it out fast because, especially at Loyola, students who were admitted at that time would not have had their degrees recognized through UDM after 1975. So when it came to actually figuring out the nuts and bolts of it, I think they didn't have a lot to go on in terms of what this would look like. So there was the reports that internally, Sir George, Loyola, both had representatives. I think the document was called a model for a new university. And if you look at that document, one thing it, I think, draws on are ideas about education in the post-World War II era specifically, and the idea of democratizing access to education. And certainly Sir George had done a brilliant job of that in the decades prior. And Loyola, I think, was moving in that direction themselves. In the 60s, we found lots of fun archival material about Loyola having advertisements in media projecting themselves as a modern institution and so forth. And it was certainly moving that way. So I think once we get to 1972, 73, the two sides are starting to see that this can work. And I think 5 years prior, that probably seemed like a long shot, even though there were just some discussions that took place. Certainly by then, it seemed like it could be a good fit.
Wow. In the fall of 2002, I was living in Montreal, just a few blocks west of Concordia, and I have vivid memories of police patrols and helicopters securing the area during protests against a certain controversial prime minister who had been invited to speak on campus. I met a lot of my neighbors that day because we were up on the roof watching the helicopters circle, and I think back to how imprudent that was of us to be doing that. Nevertheless, I made a lot of friends that day and people who went to Concordia, and they started telling me that there have been a lot of protests on campus. And then when I read the book, I learned a lot more that Concordia has been shaped by activism and student movements, including the 1969 computer center occupation. How do these moments of resistance reflect the university's evolving identity?
Well, I'd say that campus activism and student movements and student activism is really part of the DNA of Concordia University. And, it fits our motto, real education for the real world, which is partly about problem solving social conflict. And certainly the university offers the context to do that. So as editors, we were really mindful of how to ensure that these histories of activism were going to be represented in the book. And I'd say that we were able to do this in inventive and sometimes oblique ways. So, for instance, the event that you're referring to, which was when Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was invited onto campus by Hillel, the Zionist student group, and it became very controversial in the city at large. There isn't a special section on it, but it is mentioned in Brandon and Matthew Perry's article. So, there's multiple examples of that where we wanted to ensure that certain things were mentioned, but they didn't need to be necessarily highlighted, for instance. So, for instance, the visual story on student media does a kind of double duty because it also shows moments of student campus activism. And then the chapter that you're referring to, which was by Christiana Abraham on the Computer Center occupation in 1969, which was actually pre-Concordia, Sir George Williams, the way that we represented it in the book was actually through an exhibition and recognition of the original event on its 50th anniversary in 1999. So there was like a large event on campus that happened in 1999 to commemorate that moment. And I think that 50-year reflection now more powerfully and proactively addresses issues of anti-Black racism in education, at the university itself, and beyond, in a way that the original event itself, had it been just focused on, wasn't able to do in the same way. I'd say also in the student oral histories, there's a lot that's on the student activism, People's Potato, the farm, different kind of events that happened on campus. And I think also there's a kind of pragmatic feminist politics that really runs through the entire book. In the history of the Simone de Beauvoir Institute, which is a chapter in itself by Vivienne Namaste, but also through the incredible oral histories with some of the early feminists on campus who were working as both staff and faculty at Concordia. They give an amazing snapshot of the gender politics at that moment in time at the inception of the university itself.
Yeah, that part of the book, I think how it came together was one thing. I think when I first joined the project, I think like a lot of people wondering in the history department, PhD students, some professors, people familiar with Concordia's history had asked me, how are you going to approach these more controversial topics? And certainly 2002 Nana's visit was foremost in people's minds. I was not in Montreal at the time, so I didn't have any personal experience with it. But when me and Matthew Penny had thought about writing the George Bourdet chapter, we were thinking of that event, but also so many other different movements over the years that Concordia had been home to, and that students, but also staff and faculty in a lot of cases, were also a part of. And we didn't even mention it in our chapter, but in the 1980s, anti-apartheid activism was very strong at Concordia. There was also, Monika had mentioned the strong through line of feminist politics throughout the book. Concordia was sites where that generation of feminists from the 70s and 80s were pushing for things like childcare on campus and so forth. So radical proposals at the time. And so Concordia was a place, I think, that invited that kind of experimentation, but also the students and the community, again, were bringing those ideas to bear on the institution itself. And I think if anything, what me and Matthew tried to communicate in the Bourdet chapter is that Bourdet argued through a pretty big historical event, the French Revolution, that ordinary people are historical actors. They make history. And that often gets ignored. And of course, there's a bit of a subtext here in terms of thinking about institutional histories, ignoring the people that actually make up the institution's history. Again, coming back to the relations. So I think, in that whole student activism, campus activism section, all the authors that contributed it, including chapters on the Maple Spring, really identified the spontaneity, but also the creative ideas that were forming amongst mainly students and broaching some very big topics and big questions.
You've already addressed part of the next question, but I'd like to ask it anyway. In a province that has many post-secondary institutions, what's unique about Concordia's approach to education, and how has this approach been shaped by the institutional history?
Yeah, so I think, I hope I did Ron's chapter justice. Again, it's just an economy of words and it's brilliant. But there's not too many institutions that have that merger story where a new identity is created. And in the book, we have an excerpt for one of the oral histories. And in one of those interviews, the former head archivist, Nancy Morelli, she rejects the premise of the book itself, which I think is brilliant because she says in her interview, Concordia is not 50 years old. And she says it bluntly. And she recounts how at one point she'd been asked to look into a founding date for some kind of promotional thing or whatever at the university. And she put it down to, forget the exact date, but it was, I think, 1896. So thinking about those roots, the Jesuit roots, thinking of Sir George, thinking about the roots in the evening classes, so on, those were two distinct cultures and student bodies as well. But then they had to come together. So I think that is unique because I think that people who were at those places would say that part of them or part of those traditions continued in different ways, but also new ones were, of course, created. So there's not too many examples that I'm aware of. And I think that that's definitely something that makes us unique.
Well, in the book's final section, Donna Goodleaf calls for structural changes at Concordia. How does the book balance celebrating the university's achievements and unique history with critical reflections on ongoing challenges?
We were so aware as we were making this book that this book was being made at a moment in which the university and education was at a transformative moment. And so while we were kind of looking at Concordia's past, we were also really interested in ensuring that we cast an eye on the future and thinking about, well, what does this history tell us, not only about the present, but what the future might ensure. And Brandon has this really interesting anecdote about how that chapter itself got shaped and emerged, which was initially a conversation that I had with Donna Goodleaf and which got edited down and distilled because I knew that she would bring such a unique vision as someone who was working in the Center for Teaching and Learning, but also was a Mohawk woman from this territory that we're on.
Yes, I remember very clearly when Monika had brought in the unedited version of the interview. At that point, I think we were in the summer of 2023, and we had just organized our own office in the Fine Arts Building where we were taking different chapter titles, printing them out in big text, and then cutting them out and then pasting them on the wall to look at the running order and so forth. And actually, when we first put the manuscript together, believe it or not, the different sections, including the student dossiers and oral histories and the individual chapters, added up to 49. And that was by accident. And of course, we had to do 50. But when Monika asked me what I thought of Donna's interview, I thought it encapsulated so much of what the book was trying to do. It was forward looking, but it was also critical. It was challenging. It echoed questions that appeared earlier in the book through Manon Tremblay's oral history and questions that Peter Gossage had posed in his chapter on Grey Nuns, thinking about difficult history and legacies and so forth. So it had this kind of bookend feeling to it. I don't know if we had like an ending at that point. We knew Whitelaw was going to write an afterword, and she wrote a great one, but it really felt like Donna's interview was just going to provide us the bookend we needed, but also in a way that was going to point to the future. And I think what she does in that interview is really important in terms of raising questions about reconciliation, of course, and what does that mean for institutions in Canada, but also saying like critique is part of university life. It's part of, something we teach our students, especially in the humanities. And so if we can't handle critique, then we're not living up to the values that we profess. And so I think Donna lays that out in a brilliant way.
Monika, you mentioned earlier that you both learned a lot putting this project together as co-editors. I'd like to end with a question for both of you. What aspect of Concordia's history did you find the most interesting?
I have to say, Brendan and I were really puzzling about this, and I really had to think about what it was that stood out overall about the history, but also as a result of making this book. And I think Brandon and I both think that it's the kookiness of Concordia's community that really hopefully stands out in this book. We were so fortunate to have President Graham Carr and the former Provost Anne Whitelaw, who were both a historian and an art historian, who basically gave us carte blanche to do whatever we wanted. And that really liberated what we were going to be able to put into the book and what we were able to consider. One thing that stands out for me looking at the book again, now that it's been, I think, over a year, maybe a year and a half, is how the public art, which kind of punctuates the entire book, locates you in a kind of geographical space, which really generates a lot of kind of memories of moving through space. I mean, on the cover, we have the shuttle bus, and there's like a special photograph and an amazing caption that Brandon wrote about the shuttle bus. And, back when the university, I think it was like in the early 2010s, the university had done a survey and a consultation with the whole university. But what do you think our logo should be? And so many people said that they thought it should be the shuttle bus. So we thought this was kind of the perfect characterization of what the Concordia experience is, I think, for staff, for students, and for faculty.
Yes, I think the kookiness is definitely very memorable and fun little archival stories that never quite made sense, and there was not enough to verify. But looking back on the book, and I remember at some point, I think for a period, the sports teams at Concordia had settled already on stingers, but didn't have a mascot for B. So borrowed a mascot from the Concordia Student Union that was a bear. So I think at some point during home games, there was a bear mascot with, that didn't match the name. And I think, again, just people improvising and experimenting, it stands out. And the other thing that stands out for me is just the relationships. Again, to come back to that theme, we tried to represent that in the book, but we were a part of it too. And when you're a graduate student, as you both know, it's a different experience than an instructor, a professor. And, I'd gone from working on my own to all of a sudden meeting all these people in the university that I had no knowledge of, and all these different departments and all the different professions and all the different expertise and all of that, I think, fed into the book from the university press to the archives and onwards. And so that part was really cool. It was cool to be a part of a project with so many different people contributing. If we add up the oral history interviewees and the whole production team and all our authors, of course, we're over 100 people, easy. And all of them had their own Concordia stories. They all had their own strong ideas about what their individual contributions should be or what the book would look like. And I think the book is better for that because it was, again, those kind of relations that were ultimately the book structure reflects. And I think that's something that really stands out in my memory.
Well, I did love the kookiness of it as well. I think that's a good word to use. I also like, though, it's such a sophisticated overview and insight into a living and breathing organism that is a modern university. I really felt like I got to know Concordia, I lived by it, and I had some sense of the energy and dynamism of Concordia University. But now I feel from reading the book that I've had some real insights into what makes that institution so special. So I think even if you're not alumni, that any of our listeners, I encourage you to read this book to get an idea of what this special place is. My guests today have been Monika Gagnon and Brandon Webb discussing their co-edited book, Concordia University at 50, A Collective History, published by Concordia University Press in 2024. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having us, Nicole.
Thank you, Nicole. That was a lot of fun.
You've been listening to Witness to Yesterday. Please visit our website at www.champlainsociety.ca to learn more about the important work of the Champlain Society. And please feel free to share this podcast on social media. Reviews are always welcome. This podcast is made possible by the members of the Champlain Society who work hard to bring original documents in Canadian history to life. We would like to thank several Canadian scholarly publishers, including the University of Toronto Press, UBC Press, and McGill Queen's University Press for their financial support. My name is Nicole O'Byrne. This interview was recorded on June 23, 2026. It was produced by Kevin Ball and supported by the University of Toronto Press Journal team.